The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we speak to the peace envoy from Thornhill, Ontario, who met one-on-one with deposed Syrian dictator Bashar Al-Assad in a story never before made public. Then, author and professor Michael Higgins joins us to discuss his new book on Pope Francis. That's ahead on the agenda. With the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria, the story of a daring diplomatic mission undertaken more than a decade and a half ago can now be told. Syria and Israel have been implacable foes for more than three-quarters of a century. But in 2007, a resident of Thornhill, Ontario, met secretly with Assad for 2.5 hours in hopes of beginning a peace process with Israel. That man was Moshe Ronen, who has never previously publicly discussed his peace mission, and he joins us now in studio. Moshe, let's full disclosure. You and I have known each other a long time. I call you Moshe, so great to have you here.
Good to be with you, Steve.
I want to set this up. We're going to go back to July 4th, 2007. You are in Damascus, Syria. You are there because, quite remarkably, the American President George Bush, the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and the Syrian President Bashar Al-Assad all agree that you and Assad should have a meeting in the presidential palace. How did that happen?
Well, it's as crazy as you described it. Through a coincident meeting with a friend of the Syrian ambassador to Washington, I was invited to a meeting in D.C. with the Syrian ambassador, who was very close to Assad. And we discussed the history of Israel-Syria relations. He was very interested in my involvement in the community, my views about peace, and he told me that his president is a peacemaker, and I should come to Syria and hear for myself, and invited me to Syria.
What did you think when he said that?
I thought he was nuts. I have dual Israeli and Canadian citizenship, and I told him, I can't go to Syria. And he said, no, I mean to come and meet the president. And I said, well, I'd have to talk to my Prime Minister Harper, and also to Prime Minister Olmert in Israel, which I did.
And they both gave you the green light?
They both gave me the green light, and Harper also said he wanted to get clearance from President Bush because there was an idea that Harper, if something comes out of this, that Harper might play a role.
You walk into the palace in Damascus where President Assad lives, and what do you see?
I see at the very end of a long hallway, I see a tall man standing and waiting for me, and I couldn't believe it. I had to pinch myself that this was really happening. And there he was, the president of Syria, and said to me, welcome to Syria, Moshe. May I call you Moshe?
He asked if he could call you by your first name.
Yeah, I said, absolutely, Mr. President.
You called him Mr. President?
I called him Mr. President, yes.
How much homework had he done on who you were before he met with you?
Well, he said to me, you came here from Israel, because I crossed through Jordan and Syria from Israel, having met with Olmert prior to the visit. And I said, Mr. President, don't tell anybody, because Israelis are not allowed in Syria. And he laughed and he said, not only that, you're a Zionist, you're pro-Israel, your father came to Israel on a very famous ship. And I said, Mr. President, I see your intelligence people did a whole X-ray on me. And he said, no, Moshe, I surfed the net. And that broke the ice.
I surfed the net. How was his English?
Excellent. He's educated in London. He's an eye doctor, a specialist. He never intended to be president. I think his father, the elder father, had wanted the eldest son to succeed him, but there was some tragic car accident, and ultimately Bashar took office. And he spoke English and spoke to me just as you and I are speaking now in studio.
How much security did you have to go through before you could see him?
As I mentioned, I saw Prime Minister Olmert earlier the day in the morning, and I had to go through a lot of security. When I went to see President Assad, nobody checked anything.
Nothing?
Nothing.
You weren't frisked? You didn't go through an X-ray machine?
No. I was accompanied by the ambassador and his chief of protocol, and They walked me right into the palace.
You talked for 2 hours in that meeting. I mean, I have to think it was a wide-ranging...
2.5 hours.
2.5 hours. What did you talk about?
Well, he explained his vision about Syria. We talked about the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He made it clear, as he put it, my father was a man of war. I am a man of peace. I will never go to war against Israel. And I see Israel as the road to America. And he made the argument that he is a man who wants to create a peace agreement between Syria and Israel. And he was very happy that I had discussed the visit with my Prime Minister Harper. And it was suggested that Mr. Harper be an intermediary, and somehow the three of them meet to discuss his vision.
Are you ready for a bit of a smart-ass question here? Okay, he says he don't want to go to war against Israel. Did you ever ask him, then why are you going to war against your own people? I mean, he was torturing and gassing his own people, as his father did.
Well, at that time, there was less of that was at least known. Certainly, he was seen as a dictator, and certainly his father had a very, very stained history. But Assad was not, labeled a war criminal, and had not been, at least the evidence wasn't in or accusatory. And I think he was someone that we were prepared to talk to. Certainly, Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Olmert were ready to meet with him.
As you are sitting there listening to this guy, who is an implacable foe of Israel's, talk about how he wants to make peace with Israel and have an opening to the United States of America, and of course at this point Syria is basically a Russian proxy in so many ways, could you believe what you were hearing?
Well, I said, Mr. President, how is it that you want peace when on your way over, your ambassador who was with us at the meeting pointed out to me the Iranian embassy, and the Iranians were anti-Israel back then as they are now, and Hezbollah headquarters. And he leaned over and he said, Moshe, and he sort of with a snicker, I'm a dictator. I could have these people arrested tomorrow. I need to have American diplomatic, military, and economic support. And if I have those three things, I'm ready to forge a link and change sides.
Now, this is 2007.
Correct.
So it's at a time when George W. Bush is trying to, some would say encourage, others would say force, Middle Eastern Arab nations into embracing more democratic practices. What did Assad think about that?
Well, it's interesting. Prime Minister Harper, in order to be part of this, what we hope would be a positive project, got clearance from President Bush. And in reference to President Bush, President Assad said, my problem is President Bush. Not because I can't deal with him, but he has this idea, or America has this idea, that unless we bring our style of democracy into the Middle East, into the Arab world, we will never be able to move these people forward and make a deal and make peace with them. And he doesn't understand, Bush doesn't understand, says Assad. You cannot bring our kind of democracy, the one I'm used to, that I learned about when I was in London, or the democracy that you come from in Canada, because the bad guys will be elected here, and I'll be hanging in the center of Damascus even before you. So I think what he tried to say is that deal with this regime. The regime has its own philosophy, but that doesn't say that we can't negotiate a peace agreement.
After 2 hours in the room with the other people there as witnesses, you did something very unusual. You asked everybody else to leave, and you had a one-on-one with him alone.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
I said, Mr. President, before I leave, I have a personal message from Prime Minister Olmert, and I was directed by Prime Minister Olmert only to deliver it, as he put it, in 4 eyes, just with the President. And I had told your ambassador that I was going to do this, and the President said, of course, absolutely. And we spent about 20 minutes together alone, where I delivered a very personal message from Prime Minister Olmert, a message about peace.
Can you say what was in that message?
Well, that's former Prime Minister Olmert's prerogative. It was a personal message. I can tell you that it was a message of peace. It was a message about the kind of compromises that Olmert was willing to put forward. And I believe that there was a real sincerity.
Now, the trouble is, of course, if Assad was on shaky ground, so was Olmert. How much longer did he last as Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, that was one of the problems. Olmert was on his last leg. He was starting to have some problems, and it looked evident that he was going to be leaving the political arena. But Assad was also weak, and Assad said, you know, I'm weak, Prime Minister Olmert is weak. Weak people need to come together, and we can forge a peace. And he believed that that could be an advantage at that time.
Okay, so you have the private one-on-one meeting with him, and then after that's over, he makes a strange suggestion to you. What did he suggest?
Well, he said that, would you like to take something back to Prime Minister Olmert, who I was planning to meet the next day, report on the meeting? And I looked around the room and I said, well, what do you have in mind? And he said, I want to send you some Syrian hummus. Syrian hummus. I know Mr. Olmert likes hummus. And I have a package for you and for the Prime Minister, if you would deliver it. And I did.
So you took the hummus from the Syrian president, you took it back to Israel, and you and the Israeli Prime Minister did what?
Well, you know, I took it to Prime Minister Olmert. I came to visit him in his bureau. His security detail knew that I had a personal relationship with him, so, you know, they checked me, but they didn't. Hummus. I'm bringing him some hummus. They had no idea where it's from. And as soon as I walked into the room, Prime Minister Olmert says, Moshe, sit down, tell me about your meeting. And I said, before that, Prime Minister, I have something that you really will enjoy. Hummus. I opened the hummus, and I brought some pita from my hotel in Tel Aviv, and we both dipped into the hummus, and Olmert says to me, this is delicious. Where'd you get it? And I said, this is from President Assad. And Prime Minister Olmert, you know, bangs the table and says, holy, I can't believe this. And my security people let you in with this? And I said, I didn't tell them. And that sort of is the summary of my feeling about the visit. President Assad, I think, is sincere, wants to make a peace agreement with you. And, you know, the rest were the details.
I don't have to tell you. I mean, it could have poisoned the both of you, right?
I had no fear whatsoever that Assad would poison us.
Just before your meeting with the Syrian president ended, and I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, can you bring up this shot, please? You two posed for a picture. How did that picture happen?
Well, at the end of the meeting, I was surprised when, because the meeting was a secret exchange. The president asked me if I would like a picture with him, and I said, absolutely I would. And photographer came in and took a picture, and an hour later was delivered to my hotel before I left for Israel.
There cannot be too many people in Canada who have a one-on-one picture with Bashar al-Assad.
I doubt it.
I mean, maybe, well, I was going to say, you know, a former prime minister might have it, but even that, I'm not sure. You might be the only person in the whole country.
I don't know if it's in the whole country, but I can say I'm still pinching myself to see that this meeting really happened. And I have a lot of sadness about the fact that it didn't transpire to what I had hoped it would.
Well, let's get into that, because something, just a few weeks after this meeting transpired, something happened, and basically that was that. What happened?
Well, you know, I had an exchange with former Prime Minister Harper a few days ago, because Assad, just before he fell, just before the rebels took over, turned to the Americans and said, come and save me from this attack, and I'll switch sides. And we both knew that it was too late. The opportunity was in 2007, and it was too late. Now, about 2 weeks after I was in Syria, Israel bombed and took out the nuclear reactor in Syria, which Prime Minister Olmert ordered. And, you know, that was something that obviously I didn't know about, but Olmert made it very clear, and I delivered the message through the ambassador, that it had nothing to do with his desire to make peace. In other words, this was something Israel had to do because of its defense. But unfortunately, you know, it was a big international event. But if you remember, Syria did not respond.
No, they didn't, which was unusual at the time.
Correct.
Israel bombed nuclear installations in Syria, and Syria did not respond militarily. But Olmert, knowing about your visit, and knowing that if he bombs something inside Syria, surely that will be the end of any potential peace process, does it anyway? Did he make the wrong decision?
No, I don't think so. Olmert made it absolutely clear that, excuse me, this had nothing to do with the intensity of his desire to make peace. This had to do with a threat that here was a country that was at war with Israel, and a country which is very hostile was about to have the nuclear capacity that the North Koreans were supplying. And Olmert was not going to tolerate. The Americans knew about it, the Israelis knew about it, and Israel had to do what it needed to do for its own self-defense. But it had nothing to do with the desire to make peace. This was a military decision that took place. People were not killed. The installation was taken out. And if anything, I think, it provided more of an opportunity for peace. You know, George Bush told Prime Minister Harper that he was skeptical about my visit and the messages. But they apparently exchanged secret messages following the visit, which were all very positive and seemed to encourage them that there would be something out of the visit. Unfortunately, I think President Assad got cold feet, did not go to a secret meeting that he was supposed to have with our Prime Minister and ultimately with Olmert, and the idea fell apart.
Okay, I got to follow up on that. So at some point after your meeting, there was supposed to be a meeting between Olmert, Harper, and Assad?
Which Harper was going to convene secretly at the heels of the United Nations September meetings, where heads of state come from all over the world. No one would suspect anything at that point, and they would meet. Assad at the last moment got cold feet and instead said he wants Prime Minister Harper to come to Damascus. And Harper said, there's no way I can get to Damascus and do this secretly. And the idea fell apart, and the rest is history, unfortunately.
So this is 2007, so that's 17 years ago, 17 and a half years ago that this meeting took place. And in that 17 and a half years, how often have you thought to yourself, boy, we got close to achieving something pretty exciting that could have changed the world, and it didn't happen? How much do you regret that it didn't happen?
Well, I regret it very much. The whole war in Syria, I think, would have been avoided if Israel and Syria were at peace, because Israel would have, I think, participated along with America to make sure, the civil war would come under some control. I'm no expert, but I'm very regretful, and it just shows how much, sometimes personalities, obviously leadership, is what makes or break peace agreements. And unfortunately, there were many years of war that followed this visit.
When you heard that he had been overthrown by his own people and forced into exile in Moscow, what went through your head?
Well, Assad is a dictator. I'm convinced that he had to, at some point, leave office, and at some point there had to be some kind of democracy in Syria. But I'm not sure that the rebels, unless we're surprised again, but given some of the history of the leadership, I'm not sure that that's the right formula that will bring about the peace that I'd like to see in the region.
Is it possible, we're just starting to find out more about who's in charge in Syria right now. Is it possible they'll be even worse than he was?
I think a lot of it depends on American leadership and on Western leadership. I think what Assad said to me about the fact that the West, if they come with economic, military, and that kind of support, I think there's a possibility, because these rebels are at odds with the Iranians, who are the biggest troublemakers in the neighborhood, and the Russians, there's a possibility of some kind of at least a dialogue with Israel, a dialogue with America. And if that happens, I think we should encourage it, Canada, along with the rest of the West, and maybe we can see a different Middle East.
Well, let's finish up on that, because Israel's got peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, under President Trump the first time around, the Abraham Accords with several other Arab states. Syria was always thought to be the nut you cannot crack. They are just the worst of enemies and have been ever since the creation of the State of Israel. Can you imagine, with Assad now gone, in your lifetime, peace between Israel and Syria?
I can. I really can. I think that it depends on the support that we decide to give it. It depends whether this new regime in Syria, if it continues, turns west or turns again to the Iranians. I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful. And the Iranians already made it clear that they hope that they will remain anti-Israel. I hope that the opposite will be true. There are some signs. There are some signs that I've seen in the press where the rebels have talked about some kind of peaceful reach out to Israel. But it's too early, Steve. It's too early. But I'm hopeful. I'm always an optimist.
Well, you've been sitting on this story for a very long time, and we are glad that you decided to tell it here tonight. So thank you, Moshe.
Thank you for telling it, and I hope that it'll inspire maybe some good things.
In his latest book, The Jesuit Disruptor, a personal portrait of Pope Francis, Michael Higgins offers a nuanced look at a complex pope with a simple agenda, radically reforming the Catholic Church. Michael is the Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the U of T's St. Michael's College, and he joins us now for more. It's great to have you in that chair again.
Thank you, Steve.
How are you doing these days?
I'm doing fairly well. Now
Good.
that I'm talking to you, of course.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Let's start with the title of the book. You call him the Jesuit Disruptor. You didn't say revolutionary, you didn't say rebel, you said disruptor. Why that word?
Well, disruptor seemed to me the right word when talking about Bergoglio's papacy, because what he does is he disrupts the patterns. He disrupts the expectations. He disrupts the standard modes of doing things. But he doesn't do it in a malignant way. It's interesting, you know, disruptor can be spelled both with an ER and an OR. If it's an OR, it's a largely benign reading. If it's an ER, it's somebody who is like a kid who disrupts a class or something like that.
How do you even know that?
Well, I look it up.
Okay.
I look it up because
Okay.
somebody was complaining about the fact. In fact, a past president of the American Catholic Association, University Association in Washington, who was very supportive of the book, and he said, you know, I think that word disruptor is going to put a lot of people off. And I said, no, I don't think it will. I think it will attract readers because it says something about the nature of the man which is consistent throughout his papacy. And he said, well, I object to the use of the term, but then I went and I looked it up, and you're right. It's the positive use of the term, and I thought...
Because it's OR.
It's OR.
All right.
It's OR.
Let's do an example. Where does he live?
He lives in the Santa Marta, which is a house, an apartment complex, actually, designed for visiting cardinals and for dignitaries and for others. It's really not a housing complex, but it's a residence adjacent to the Vatican.
But the bottom line is he doesn't live where most of the popes live.
No, he does not live in the Apostolic
Why not?
Palace, and that was his decision from the outset. I think that goes back to our conversation about him being disruptive. Here's another perfect example of it. Not only does he choose to live in the Apostolic Palace, the first place he goes to visit, Steve, is not Argentina. In fact, he's never gone to Argentina. Many of the popes who are non-Italian have gone back very early in their pontificate to their place of birth. John Paul went often to Poland. Benedict went to Germany. Francis goes to Lampedusa, an island off the southern coast of Italy, which is currently occupied by great numbers of migrants fleeing North Africa. So his decision is to go and to be with the people, with those suffering, with those who have been displaced. So I think those are just examples of how he disrupted expectations, protocols, the ways of doing things that have been cemented, seasoned, and matured for centuries. He just breaks out of them.
He's a fascinating paradox because, as you describe him in the book, he simultaneously is the disruptor, while at the same time being deeply faithful to the traditions of the Church. How do you do both at the same time?
Well, I think if I had called him the Jesuit innovator, that might have given a slightly different resonance to the book and to my interpretation. He doesn't invent new doctrines. He hasn't departed from the organic tradition. You're quite right. He's faithful to the tradition as he understands it, because he's Peter. He's the principle of unity in the Catholic Church. So he doesn't want to tinker with the tradition he inherited. But he also knows that tradition is inadequate, that in many ways it's deficient, that it's always a struggle with pathologies of the institutional as well as spiritual. Where do you go to recover the original spirit of the gospel? How do you bring back life into the witness and meaning of the church in ways that are not unfaithful to the tradition, but are a significant departure from the way it's been practiced? I think when we look at Francis, we have to think of somebody who is setting a template for evolving reform, that he's more interested in establishing a process and a culture of understanding and mutual respect than he is in introducing anything radical in terms of a departure from the Catholic tradition.
Well, here's something radical. I think in our lifetime, we've had 23 Johns, and we've had 6 Pauls, and we've had 16 Benedicts, and we've had 2 John Pauls.
Yes.
The one Francis. Why did he pick that name?
He's pretty clear about why he did. When he was sitting at the table at the time he was elected, and the Cardinal Dean, or the Cardinal Chamberlain, I guess the Cardinal Dean, comes over to him and asks him if he accepts, or maybe it's the Cardinal Vice Dean, they all have their different functions, but anyway, one of the cardinals present will come over and ask him if he accepts the vote and by what name he will be known. He's sitting beside a Franciscan who's the Cardinal Archbishop James, his name is, of Sao Paulo. And he says to him, don't forget the poor. And the realization that the poor matter, that the poor mattered specifically for Francis of Assisi, that he was talking to a Franciscan at the time, that his life has intersected with the what was often called Il Poverello from Umbria, that this specific figure had a huge impact not only on his imagination and on the way he thought of doing things, but on his own spirituality. So choosing the name Francis seemed to him natural.
Did he come up with it on the spot?
He did.
Really?
Well, you never know. He may well have been thinking about it, you know, because when they're in there and the cardinal electors are gathered, I mean, the idea must cross all their minds at one point. It might be me. If it were me, what name would I take? So my sense is he would have given it some thought, but it was quite far back in his mind, I think, although he had been number 2 the last time with Benedict I. But I think I remember being in the CTV with Lloyd Robertson at the time, and I wrongly assumed that he was thinking of Francis Xavier, because, of course, he's the great figure along with Ignatius of Loyola in the first generation of the Jesuits, and was famous as a missionary all over the world, really, all over the world as we understand it, and very close to Ignatius. And Francis sees himself as a missionary. So it seemed to me a Jesuit, Francis Xavier, but I got the wrong Francis.
Well, you were half right.
Half right.
Let's talk about how he has taken positions on some rather controversial issues related to the church. And let's start with residential schools. The Pope came here a couple of years ago, issued an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church for its role in the residential school crisis. Do you think that apology was more in line with Francis the Disruptor or Francis the Preservationist?
Oh, I think Francis the Disruptor in many ways. I think we have evidence that Francis wanted to come before he actually came, and he had to deal with the politics of the National Episcopal Conference, which he often has to do. It's not unique to Canada by any means. It's a fraught situation. Yeah, as you know, the Prime Minister had already confronted him on this personally. He has always had, I think, a very deep regard, as indeed did John Paul II, for Indigenous peoples. And so therefore, I think he wanted very much to come, and he wanted to stamp it with the notion that this was a pilgrimage of contrition, a pilgrimage of repentance on behalf of the institutional church, but also a journey to understanding. This is always true of Francis. You see it illustrated very well in the way he handled the situation on the ground in Canada. He was quiet. He was humble. He sat silently. The indigenous leaders and peoples in great measure saw in him an authenticity that not unreasonably they did not see in many other religious and political leaders.
I was going to say, Ratzinger didn't get exactly the same approach,
No, that's right. No, that's right. So that Francis, his natural gift for co-sympathy and for imaginative understanding, his depth of just listening, what he calls deep listening, actually, I think was evident throughout that trip. And so you get all kinds of leaders of the Inuit and the Métis and the First Nations, where they talked about his humility, but they also talked about his authenticity. I think that's what Francis communicated on that pilgrimage to Canada. Again, there were controversies above ground and underground, and unhappiness with the fact that one of the major liturgies was in Latin and not and insensitive to indigenous practices, and all kinds of other things came up. Debates around the meaning of the term genocide, the Pope's commentary on the plane flying back. There were many things, but I think the one thing that is constant in this is the fact that he came not to proclaim, not to declare, not to berate, but to listen humbly. And that wasn't theater, that was him.
He weighs in on a wide range of issues: immigration, economic inequality, political populism, environmental threats. To what extent do you believe that puts him, in some respects, at odds with the papacy?
I think in most cases he's not at odds with the papacy, because if you look back to Paul VI, you see already, to some degree with John the 23rd actually, but very especially with Paul VI, attention paid to the issues that we sometimes call ad extra, that by which I mean those issues outside the life of the church as a tribe. The ad intra issues, which seemed to me to predominate during the papacy of Benedict XVI, were very different in kind from Francis. Francis has in many ways resurrected many of the overriding concerns around socio-economic inequity and environmental pollution and the kind of things that John Paul II also addressed during his very long pontificate. But they're two very different personalities. And Francis's is less given to abstractions and to pontifical declarations, and more to actually listening to people, attending to them. He often talks about this, and I read about it several times in the book, Steve, that abstractions are good, ideas are good, we need them, but reality is more important.
Let's do an excerpt. Sheldon, if you would, top of page 3, let's bring this excerpt up from the book. This is from Michael Higgins, The Jesuit Disruptor. Francis has, you write, with his commitment to synodality, lit a candle of hope, of possibility, a candle of reform that, if not extinguished by his successor, could effect profound change in the way Catholics live out their lives. In the process, he could make Rome, once the center of an ecclesiastical empire, a treasured seat on the periphery, rooted in its identification with the poor, a beacon of human and spiritual harmony in a sea of dark turmoil. Now that is disruption. Well done. At a time when organized religion in so many parts of this world seems to be on decline, what makes you think he's the guy to bring it back?
But if you look at and you're attuned to this better than most, when you look as a political journalist at the geopolitical reality, you're absolutely right. And certainly there are indications of decline in institutional religious life, and have been actually for several decades. But there are also spots of revival and resurgences, and some of them I think rather unwelcome because they tend to be quite arch-conservative, going back to a time of clearer identity, sometimes even back to Pacelli, because that was a Catholic world that seemed impregnable, unassailable. Catholic identity was secure and complete, and from John 23rd on it's been kind of fractured, and Francis is fracturing it further. That would be the detractor's argument. I don't see it that way. I think what he's concluded is, look, Christendom as we understand it, particularly in Europe, is dead. Okay, it's as simple as that. The institution needs to be revived in several different ways. Maybe recapturing something of the original gospel message, less concerned with the trappings of princes and the large heritage we inherited from the Renaissance. Maybe we need to recover something of the simplicity of Francis of Assisi, something of the radicality of Jesus of Nazareth. And in order to do that, where do we go? We go to the poor, we go to the disenfranchised, we go to the abandoned, we go to the migrants. We don't go to the powers of state, largely because they're engaged in their own form of nationalism, populism, tribalism, whatever, and they don't have the individual or the individual person as their primary locus of care. The church can bring, and he's used this image many times, can bring its ministry into the battlefield. In other words, it's a field hospital. This is one of his first images as Pope, was to talk about the church not as the mystical body of Christ, not as the perfect society, but as the field hospital for the wounded and for the broken.
It's a MASH unit.
It is, absolutely, absolutely.
What are you just back from?
Rome.
You went to the Synod?
I did, second session.
What was your big takeaway?
My big takeaway is that it is a success, but not because it introduced radical measures, not because there were new decrees, not because he's altered the discipline, but because he's created the culture. Here's what you need to do in an institution that's 2,000 years old. To get people to think differently, to get them to attend to others, you need to find ways to bring them into conversation which is built on a reverencing of the other through silence, through care, and through attention. Cardinal Schönborn at the first session told us that he was approached by a Cambridge University professor, political scientist, who had also been an attaché and advisor at the UN and whatnot. And he said, you know, if we did at the UN what is going on here in synodality in Rome, we would minimize the international conflicts on the global stage, because you actually are listening to each other, not getting up in your various seats and whatnot and providing some kind of magisterial intervention, but actually listening to each other with a seriousness that comes from respect. He changed that. He changed the way we did synods, Steve, because we did synods the way this man was talking about the UN, where people sit, they get up, they read, sometimes they don't even get up, they read, then they pull back, and occasionally there's dialogue, but rarely is there encounter. All the time, Francis argues for the creation of a culture of dialogue and encounter, and that only happens when you enter into a person's space. So take the church, the imperial church of the Tiber, and take it to the precincts, the peripheries, the forgotten places, and there will be the spiritual revival of the church.
There's one line in this book that really stuck with me, and ironically enough, it's not about him. It's about you.
Yeah.
You wrote, "I have always loved popes, whether pontificating or otherwise, ever since I developed pre-reflexive consciousness." Okay, how come?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's the theater. Maybe it's the high drama. Maybe it's even the kind of lonely isolation of an individual over against the world. Now, these would have been the fantasies of a teenager, right? And of a young university student. I don't think like this way at all anymore. But that brought me into an area of interest that has remained with me, because I actually trained as a Victorianist. I mean, studying the papacy has become a major life avocation, but it was not my primary training. The interest I have in the papacy is greatly drawn from those personal qualities of interest. And like you, the first pope I ever encountered was Paul VI in the Castel Gandolfo when he was coming in. And I was standing beside a Jewish couple, older Jewish couple from Brooklyn, who broke into they broke into the Pater Noster from the Missa de Angelis beautifully. I mean, and I thought that I knew they were Jewish because we talked before the Pope came in, and they brought him in the old gestatoria, sedis gestatoria, which was when they carried him, and they would have all kinds of feathers and whatnot, very much like a potentate, an Eastern European, not Eastern European, but Eastern potentate. They carried him, and they don't do that anymore. They got rid of that. But the tremendous mystique of the papacy You know, and that's an important thing to understand, is the mystique. What Francis has done as a disruptor has in no small part upset that mystique. Because what he's saying is, look, I'm Bishop of Rome, I'm a bishop, I'm a Christian, I'm human, I live in the world, I have responsibilities of the world, I happen to be the Pope, but I'm not living in the palace. Okay, so that first disruption is discontinuity.
Just for the record here, when you saw Pope VI, how many feet away were you from him?
Probably more than you, because I'm shorter than you. Maybe 3 or 4 rows.
3 or 4 rows?
Yeah.
Okay. I was one of 10,000 people in St. Peter's Square just looking up at a window in the balcony. So you had a much...
Yes.
Just for the record,
Just
you were
for
much,
the record,
you
I
were
was
much closer.
to him.
And mine was in 1977. When was yours?
1971.
71. Okay, so...
You were 1 year before he died.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is absolutely right, yeah. How many have you met altogether? How many popes?
Well, Benedict, I actually interviewed Benedict, but not when he was Pope, when he was Grand Inquisitor, when I was writing the biography of Cardinal Carter of Toronto with my colleague. And I met him in the Holy Office of the Inquisition. John Paul II, from a distance, he would meet with various Catholic University presidents periodically, but by the time we got to that stage, his various impairments were significant, that was much reduced. The Pope I would have liked very much to meet was John Paul I, right?
Sadly, he did not stay around long.
No, he didn't. Less than a month, Albino Luciani. And I didn't, of course, meet John the 23rd. I was in high school when he died.
Who was the church basement Pope?
Me.
Yes. How did you get... That's a nickname you had.
Yeah, that's the nickname.
Where'd you get that?
Well, I got it from I used to write a column for the Zavarian Weekly, and the people on the board of the Zavarian Weekly included Frank McKenna, former premier of New Brunswick and ambassador to Washington. So there was Frank, and there was a well-known ophthalmologist, then Peter Doherty, who then became a cabinet minister in New Brunswick, and myself. We were all part of it. Was like a university, like varsity, okay? But it was at St. FX and Antigonish, and so the Zavarian Weekly was the student newspaper. And my column was, as a campus editor, was to write about various things that interest me, and I wrote about things about the church. The big crisis over birth control in 1968, right? That kind of stuff. The kind of things you would be interested in as a teenager or a late adolescent. And so, really about that. And one of the professors, who was from Colorado originally, I think, couldn't take it anymore. And he said, I can't tolerate these spoutings and pontifications coming from this church basement pope whose language I admire, but whose zeal I deplore. So anyway, this created a natural crisis among members of the Department of English, some who defended me, some who didn't and whatnot. And I was only a kid, like I didn't know. I mean, I just assumed that my fellow students or peers were reading this. Clearly they weren't. But other people were reading it and was taking them off. So I was called the church basement pope. And I thought, I'm going to use that. I mean, it was pejorative at the time, but I'm going to use that because it's a
badge of honor. Wear it.
Well, that's right. It's good.
Well, did he understand that by accusing you of pontificating?
Yeah.
That's from the Latin word for pope.
Well, he did. Well, yes.
Pontifex Maximus.
Pontifex Maximus, the big bridge builder. He actually relented, and about a year later wrote to say that he had been premature in his judgment, but he had also been right.
Let's finish up on this. How much of what you describe in this book do you think Francis will make permanent, and how much of it depends on his successor, whoever and whenever that is, continuing in this vein?
I think a lot would depend on the successor, frankly. And he's already, I mean, you're always interested in matters political, I know. So you would know that succession planning is always a key thing, right? But popes are not supposed to be engaged in succession planning, although there was an indication that John the 23rd tipped his tiara, as it were, for Montini. By and large, they keep their distance from it, of course. But they stack the College of Cardinals because those are the electors, right? So the Pope currently has created, and the technical word is create, he's created the majority of the College of Cardinals now. It would be in the high 60, maybe even 70%, 70+%. But here's the kicker. There's no guarantee that the electors that he created will necessarily look for the same qualities in their successor. They may feel that, okay, Francis disrupted things, now we need a pacifier. My sense is that that would be not a good thing. The good thing would be to build on the various movements that he has generated. I think if you look at the constitution of the current college, there are several who would be what they call papabile, but you got to remember that they're not confined to that. They can go outside the college, right? And the other thing is, does seem to me that it is very unlikely that he'll be succeeded by a Jesuit. I think they'll say, well, that was fun. We'll leave that alone for a while.
Try something else now.
Yeah, they've had religious order priests. They've had Franciscans and Benedictines in the past, Dominicans, but this was their first Jesuit. And that in itself was a disruption, both for the order and for the church.
I got to tell you, I always love your visits here. You're
They're great fun.
you're just a delight to speak to, and I'm happy to put on people's night tables, they should consider The Jesuit Disruptor, a personal portrait of Pope Francis, the one and only. Michael W. Higgins, always great to have you here.
Thank you, Steve. Always good to be with you.
One day I was walking along the pond path, and it goes into the forest, and it's just quite magical in there, and it's just wandering around, just kind of mesmerized by the trees. And then off to the right there's this booth, this little thing, and there's a phone, like the old school phone with the rotary.
It's strange to come upon a phone in the middle of nowhere. For one moment I thought, could this be an emergency situation? No, it was a phone to talk to the dead.
I have been working with people who are dying for my entire career. So I would say I've probably worked with thousands of people at the end of life as a music therapist. And so when I picked up the phone, I was like struck by who would I want to hear from? Who would I want to interact with? Where are you? How has it been? You know, I was sort of flooded by a memory of a lot of different people.
It looks like the life that I shared with Mom and Dad for so many years.
My name is Catherine Manning, and I am a music therapist, and I live and work in Guelph, Ontario. So I work at Hospice Wellington, which is a beautiful hospice facility offering 10 beds and end-of-life support for folks with wonderful nursing and healthcare support.
I'm Linda Clark. I live here in Guelph. I'm Peter and Jerry Clark's daughter. I came upon Keith's wind phone in June of last year. And even though my parents died 6 years ago, grief is ongoing, and the wind phone was a really sweet and important part of that.
Well, I think what's really neat about the wind phone is that it's an access point for an expression of grief, or to externalize our grief. They provide an avenue to interact with our grief. I have a sense of them being like a side door to encounter feelings that we have around the losses that we have. In the wake of a death, people are in an altered state. Having opportunities for encounters with nature, beauty, aesthetics, the arts, and the wind phones, it's something of a symbolic intermediary, as something that you can interact with through another means. What's difficult sometimes with grief and bereavement, or with losing somebody, is that to look at it straight on is very difficult, especially when you're in that state of shock or a raw state afterwards. A wind phone in the woods is really an interesting invitation. First of all, being in the woods opens your senses. It allows you to enter into a bit of a different space, a liminal space, where all of the old rules don't apply, and it allows you to touch base with the deeper mystical side of life. When you lose somebody, there's an ephemeral quality to the loss. It's very helpful in the process of adjusting to that new reality to have tools or practices that allow you to interact with the shift.
So there's a feeling of walking away from regular world, regular life. There is that physical beauty of these trees that go higher and higher, and it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. For my mom, not unusual for women of her time, the phone was her lifeline forever. So many of the memories I have of Mom are sitting at the table talking on the phone, picking up the phone. Who am I talking to today? My father was always, okay then, handing it over to somebody else. But it was that phone, and there was a feeling of familiarity, which is lovely, actually lovely.
My name's Keith Lamont. We're at Thistlestone Farm. I've been here for 45 years. For that time, it's been a sheep breeding operation and our home. And for the last 10 years also, we host guests who come and stay with us. So I installed the wind phone this past March. And I had read about a Canadian physician on the prairies. She sponsored one on a trail for the benefit of her patients. She thought they might embrace this opportunity to pick up a phone and talk to somebody. My wife and I in 1979 were working in jobs in the city, and we embraced the opportunity to come here and put this farm to use. In around 2005, my wife entered at about 51 years of age into the start of young onset dementia. And for about 10 years after that, she was able to continue to live here. And for the last 3 years of those 10, I had PSWs before Mary entered into long-term care center and died in 2022. So this wind phone was around the diagnosis time when life is full of turmoil. If I'd discovered something like that on my own, I would have just let loose to that. That's all past for me because there's a lot of ambiguous loss, times when you're losing another aspect of that person. This is a new endeavor for me, and I did some exploration when I discovered about wind phones. The original in Japan goes back a while, and I didn't realize there was so many wind phones. I understand there's one in Guelph, and there's one in Mississauga, and there's one here, and there's one in a small village. They're for the public just to pick up and use as they're walking by in a public space. I don't advertise the fact the wind phone's there. I want people just to discover it. So all the reward for me for this is now hearing people's response to discovering the wind phone.
When I came upon Keith's wind phone, I was astonished, would be the first word. I was astonished. The trees were what a friend of mine would call cathedral trees. It's a very quiet, secluded spot. So I was curious. I was shy. I looked around. I was reluctant because I knew there's not going to be anybody on the other end. But when you lose somebody, you keep wishing that you'd hear their voice or you'd catch a glimpse of them. And there's always a little part of me that's listening for something like that. So I looked around and there was nobody there, and I thought, okay, I'll just try this. And I got up and I read the engraving, and it was lovely, and I picked it up, and of course there's nothing, absolutely nothing, of course, on the other end. And I thought, oh, this is stupid, and I hung up and I walked away. And a couple of days passed. We were staying at Keith's farm, and I thought, go back to the wind phone and have an open mind, see if something happens. So I retraced my steps, again appreciating, and even now remembering it, appreciating the sounds at the top of the trees and the smells of the forest and all the rest of it. And I stood there in front of that phone, and I picked it up, and I spoke, and I said something. Actually, I remember very well what I said. I said, "Hi, Mom and Dad. It's Linda. We're all fine. We're all fine. We sure miss you. We wonder if you're okay. Gee, I wish you could come back and tell us we had done a good thing. Love you. Bye." And then I walked away. It stimulated memories that I hadn't thought about for a long time. So the wind phone really does work. It brings you back to places with the loved ones that you're thinking of. And for me, it was Mom and Dad. And all sorts of memories. came back, and all sorts of images, joyful, the difficult ones, all those ones came back. And you realize, that's what the wind phone is for. It's to connect us in that way. I knew that it wasn't going to, quote unquote, cure my grief. There's no cure for grief. Time changes it, but time doesn't take it away. My grief is as familiar to me as my hand is. The education around grieving is minimal. And I mean, we all experience it, and somehow when we experience it, it segregates us. Shouldn't you be over that by now? It makes me smile and occasionally giggle that, you know, I was in the middle of the woods at our friend's farm and I was laughing because I was using the phone to talk to my parents and I knew they weren't there, but it was important to me. So it's really touching on something that we need. And maybe, I mean, I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church and all the rest of it. Perhaps that's what's lacking, is that ritual that goes around saying goodbye to people that we love.
Here's a look at something we're working on.
There were no eyes on the street. I mean, in the 1970s, Jane Jacobs said, we have to have streets that are pedestrian-based, that are based on people looking at the street, opening a front door to the street, mailboxes on the street. The Regent Park that it was designed and built had none of that. So there was no oversight. It was isolated, disconnected.
That's coming up on the agenda. And that is the agenda for Friday, December 20th, 2024, our final program, incidentally, for the year, as we give way to holiday programming. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Best of the season, everyone, and we'll see you again in 2025.